Midway was not simply won by courage in the air. It was made possible first by a quieter battle of signals, guesses, and decisions made before the Japanese fleet ever came within striking distance. That is the uncomfortable contradiction at the heart of this story. Japan sailed toward Midway, intending to set a trap. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was moving a large operation across the Central Pacific with the aim of drawing out the remaining American carrier forces and extending Japan's defensive perimeter. The plan imagined Midway as bait and the United States Pacific Fleet as the prey. But northeast of Midway, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was not simply waiting to be surprised. He had warning, not perfect knowledge, not a complete map of every Japanese movement, not certainty, but enough intelligence, drawn from Japanese naval communications and interpreted by American codebreakers and fleet intelligence officers to make one of the most consequential command decisions of the Pacific War. Nimitz positioned 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, in the area from which they could strike the approaching Japanese force. Japan came looking for the American carriers. The American carriers were already there. Before Midway became a story of dive bombers falling out of the sun, before the names Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu became inseparable from fire and smoke, it was a war room story. It belonged to radio rooms, basements, plotting tables, carrier bridges, and intelligence summaries. It belonged to men trying to turn fragments of enemy traffic into a place on a map. It belonged to a code word, AF, and to a strange little deception involving an uncoded report about a shortage of water. And it belonged to a dangerous question. If the United States was still recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, and if Japan still held the strategic initiative across the Pacific, how could a smaller American carrier force meet a larger Japanese operation at exactly the right place? The battle would be fought near Midway Atoll in early June, 1942. The main action came 6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In those 6 months, the Pacific War had become a contest of distance, prediction, and air power. The ocean was too vast for armies to move like they did on land. Fleets had to search. Aircraft had to find. Commanders had to decide under conditions of uncertainty, often before the enemy was visible. Midway mattered because it was not just a remote speck in the Pacific. It was a forward American naval and air base on the route between Hawaii and Japan. Whoever thought of it only as sand and coral missed its military meaning. From Midway, patrol aircraft could watch the approaches. Aircraft could operate forward from Hawaii's outer line. Ships and planes moving through the Central Pacific had to reckon with it. To Japanese planners, striking Midway was a way to pull the United States into battle under conditions Japan hoped to control. To American planners, holding Midway helped protect Hawaii and preserve a foothold in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto's larger plan sought more than a raid. Japanese planners wanted to draw out the U.S. carrier forces and destroy them. The strategic logic was brutal and direct. If Japan could eliminate the remaining American carriers in the Pacific, it could strengthen the defensive perimeter it had been building since the opening months of the war. The trap depended on American reaction. Midway would be attacked. The United States, compelled to defend it, would send its carriers. Then, Japanese naval power would close around them. But a trap works best when the prey does not know where it is. At Pearl Harbor, the United States had been hit by surprise. At Midway, the American command had a chance to turn warning into position. That chance came from code-breaking and analysis. American codebreakers had worked against Japanese naval communications, including the major Japanese Navy enciphered code system known as JN-25. It was not magic. It was not a single cracked message that revealed everything in clean, simple language. It was a labor of codebooks, additive tables, partial recoveries, traffic patterns, and judgment. Among the key American intelligence figures were Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo and Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton. Their work helped identify Midway as the Japanese target before the battle. A Japanese designator, AF, had to be tied to a real place. The confirmation came through an operation so plain it almost disappears beside the scale of the fleets. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message about a water shortage. Japanese traffic later reported that AF was short of water. A code word became an island. A possibility became an operational target. This mattered because Nimitz did not have to scatter his scarce carriers across the Pacific and hope. He could concentrate them. He could take USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown and place them northeast of Midway in an ambush position associated with the phrase Point Luck. The name sounds almost too neat, as if history were admitting that chance had a role. And it did. Intelligence did not remove risk. It did not guarantee that American patrol aircraft would find the Japanese carriers first. It did not guarantee that launches would be coordinated, or that torpedo planes and dive bombers would arrive together, or that pilots would survive the approach. But intelligence changed the opening conditions of the battle. It meant that the Japanese operation, designed to lure the American carriers, was itself moving toward an American ambush. The American force was smaller than the Japanese operation it faced. The carriers available to Nimitz were not an unlimited reserve. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were central to the American carrier strength in the Pacific. USS Yorktown's presence was especially important because the ship had been damaged at Coral Sea and rushed back into service. At Midway, every flight deck counted. A carrier was not merely a ship. It was a mobile airfield, a moving base from which the war could be projected hundreds of miles across open ocean. The Japanese carrier force included 4 names at the center of the coming battle: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Tactically, that carrier strike force was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. These ships represented the kind of naval power that had reshaped the first months of the Pacific War. By mid-1942, carrier aviation had become the decisive instrument of naval combat. Battleships still carried prestige and heavy guns, but at Midway, the critical blows would come from aircraft finding flight decks over the horizon. That is why the war room dimension matters. A carrier battle begins before the first bomb falls. It begins with the question of who knows where to look. It begins with bearings, search arcs, radio intercepts, fuel calculations, aircraft ranges, and assumptions about enemy intention. The sea itself hides almost everything. A fleet can be enormous and still invisible. A carrier can launch aircraft that strike far beyond the horizon, but only if someone has found the target. Midway forced both sides into that problem. Japan intended to strike Midway and draw the U.S. carriers into a decisive fight. The United States intended to use intelligence to meet the Japanese force before the trap could close. Neither side controlled the full picture. Both sides moved through uncertainty. But one side had identified the target of the operation in advance, and that made all the difference in where the carriers waited. The phrase 4 minutes belongs to the most cinematic part of Midway. On June 4, 1942, U.S. carrier dive bombers struck 3 Japanese fleet carriers within minutes. Naval History and Heritage Command timeline material places those climactic attacks at about 10:22 to 10:26 in the morning. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit in those initial strikes. Hiryu escaped that first attack, only to be found and fatally damaged later. But those minutes did not come from nowhere. They were created by earlier decisions, by the identification of AF, by the concentration of American carriers northeast of Midway, by the rushed return of Yorktown, by the willingness of Nimitz to trust intelligence enough to risk precious carriers in a forward position, by the fact that Midway was not merely an isolated atoll, but a base whose location gave it strategic weight between Hawaii and Japan. The story, then, begins before the dive bombers arrive. It begins with Japan sailing to set a trap and the United States quietly moving to spring one of its own. To understand why this small place could draw the attention of admirals, codebreakers, patrol crews, carrier pilots, and entire fleets, we have to look more closely at Midway itself, not as a dot on a wartime map, but as land, reef, runway, outpost, and name. To look closely at Midway, we have to let the war room map become a real place. Not just a dot between Hawaii and Japan. Not just the target behind the Japanese designator AF. Not just the name that would later stand for carrier decks, burning ships, and 4 minutes of violence over the Pacific. Before all of that, Midway was an atoll. Low land, reef, water, birds, sand, and distance. In native Hawaiian contexts, Midway is also known as Kuaihelani or Pihemanu. Those names matter because they remind us that the place was not created by the battle. It had a geography, an older presence, and a meaning beyond the military charts of 1942. The American and Japanese fleets would make Midway famous as a battlefield, but the atoll itself belonged to a much larger chain, the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, stretching far beyond the main Hawaiian Islands into the Central Pacific. That setting is essential. Midway was not close to the mainland United States. It was not close to Tokyo. It was out in the oceanic space where distance itself became a weapon, a barrier, and a problem for commanders. Ships had to find one another across enormous water. Aircraft had to launch, search, strike, and return before fuel and weather and enemy fighters turned calculation into loss. Radio messages had to carry meaning across the sea. And a low atoll, if it had runways and patrol aircraft, could become much more than a place on the horizon. Midway Atoll's principal islands were Sand Island, Eastern Island, and the smaller Spit Island. The names are plain, almost austere, and that plainness fits the landscape. These were not high volcanic islands rising dramatically from the sea. They were small, low surfaces inside and around a reef system, exposed to the ocean and defined by it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lists Sand Island at 1,117 acres. Eastern Island is listed at 366 acres. Spit Island is far smaller, about 15 acres. Around them lay more than 88,500 acres of coral reefs. Those figures need a moment to settle, because they show the strange scale of Midway. The land was small. The surrounding reef world was vast by comparison. A modern listener might imagine a battlefield as a continent, a city, a mountain pass, or a broad front with armies moving over roads and rivers. Midway was different. Its dry land could be named in a few parts: Sand Island, Eastern Island, Spit Island. Its military importance came not from size, but from position and use. In the Pacific War, position could matter as much as mass. A small base in the right place could extend sight. It could support patrol aircraft. It could provide a field from which fighters and bombers might operate. It could serve as a warning point, a forward screen, a node in the long defensive and offensive geometry of the ocean. That is why Midway drew attention from men who were thinking in ranges, headings, and flight decks. It sat on the route between Hawaii and Japan, and for the United States, it functioned as a forward naval and air base. This phrase can sound administrative, almost dry, but in early June 1942, it was full of consequence. A forward base meant aircraft could be stationed there. Patrols could fan out from it. Reports could come back from the sea around it. If an enemy force approached, Midway might see something, signal something, absorb the first blow, and help shape the battle that followed. The atoll's military value did not erase its fragility. It intensified it. A low island base in the Central Pacific was useful because it was exposed, and endangered because it was exposed. It was a platform placed forward into contested space. Its runways and facilities made it valuable. Its location made it vulnerable. In that contradiction, the Battle of Midway begins to make geographic sense. For Japanese planners, Midway offered a way to pressure the American position in the Pacific and to draw U.S. carrier forces into battle. For Nimitz and his commanders, the same place represented something that could not simply be ignored. If Midway were threatened, Hawaii's forward approaches were implicated. If Midway could hold out long enough to scout, report, and strike, it could become part of an American ambush rather than merely the object of a Japanese attack. The landscape itself shaped what was possible. Sand Island, the largest of the atoll's islands, gave the base room and substance. Eastern Island, smaller but still significant, was part of the military geography that made Midway operational rather than symbolic. Spit Island, at about 15 acres, was a reminder of how little land was actually being contested. And beyond all three, the coral reefs formed the natural architecture of the atoll, surrounding the land and giving the place its physical identity. Seen from above, Midway would not have looked like a great fortress. Its power was not in height, walls, or heavy industry. Its power was in reach. Aircraft made reach possible. Patrol aircraft could surge outward over water. Defending fighters could rise from the atoll when warning came. Bombers and torpedo aircraft could be based there or pass through the battle space around it. Midway's existence as an airbase meant that the Japanese operation could not treat it as empty ocean. This is one of the quiet truths of the battle. The atoll mattered before the carriers found each other. Its patrol capability helped turn the surrounding sea into a watched space. Its airfield meant that any attack on Midway would be observed, resisted, and reported. Its presence forced choices. A fleet approaching Midway had to account for the aircraft on the atoll. A commander defending Hawaii had to account for what would happen if that forward position were lost or neutralized. And so Midway sat at the center of overlapping calculations. To the Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, it was part of a larger design. To Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, it was a place that intelligence had identified as central to the enemy's coming move. To the men stationed there, it was immediate and physical. Runways, aircraft, defensive positions, coral, sand, heat, and the expectation that an attack might come out of the northwest. The names Kuaihelani and Pihemanu also pull the story back from the purely operational. They make it harder to treat Midway as only a military object. War maps simplify. They reduce places to symbols, arrows, and code names. But real places carry layers. In one layer, Midway was part of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. In another, it was a U.S. naval and air base. In another, it was a target in Japanese planning. In another, it was a living atoll of land and reef. The battle would compress all of those layers into a few days in June. This compression is part of what makes Midway so powerful as history. The atoll was small enough to describe almost completely by naming 3 islands and their acreage and arges. Yet the decisions surrounding it involved the future direction of the Pacific War. Sand Islands, 1,117 acres. Eastern Islands, 366 acres. Spit Islands, about 15 acres. And the more than 88,500 acres of surrounding reefs became the physical center of a contest between carrier forces that were often far beyond sight of land. Midway's scale also helps explain the tension of the coming battle. A forward base could warn, but it could not guarantee safety. It could strike, but only within limits. It could support aircraft, but it could also be bombed. Its defenders could contribute to the fight, but they depended on larger forces at sea. And those larger forces, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, would not be sitting in the lagoon. They would be northeast of the atoll, hidden in ocean space, trying to turn Midway's danger into an opportunity. The island and the fleet were therefore connected, but not identical. Midway was the visible point. The carriers were the concealed blade. The Japanese plan aimed at the point in order to bring out the blade. Nimitz, using intelligence, had already begun to reverse that logic. He would let Midway's importance draw the Japanese operation forward, while his carriers waited beyond the immediate horizon. That is why the geography matters. Without Midway's location, there is no trap worth setting there. Without its air base and patrol role, there is no forward American presence to defend or exploit. Without its position between Hawaii and Japan, the atoll remains remote. With those things, it becomes a hinge. By early June 1942, that hinge was under immense pressure. The war had moved quickly since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had advanced. The United States was still measuring what it could risk, what it could protect, and how much carrier strength it had left. Midway, Kuaihelani, Pihemanu, small in land but large in consequence, stood in the path of those questions. To understand why the coming days felt so urgent, the calendar now matters as much as the map. The calendar now matters because Midway was not waiting in a quiet war. By early June 1942, the Pacific had already been transformed by 6 months of shock, movement, and urgent calculation. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was still close enough to feel immediate. It was not an event sealed away in memory. It was the opening wound of the American war in the Pacific, and every decision after it carried the weight of what had happened in Hawaii. 6 months is a short time for a nation to absorb disaster, rebuild confidence, and learn the shape of a new kind of naval war. Yet, that was the interval between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the main battle action near Midway. In that narrow span, the Pacific did not stand still. Japan was advancing. The United States was trying to understand not only where the next blow might fall, but what kind of war it was now fighting. That question mattered because the Pacific War had become a struggle measured across distances so large that maps could make them seem almost abstract. Hawaii, Midway, Japan, and the scattered island positions between them were not simply names. They were parts of a chain of reach and warning, of aircraft range, patrol routes, fuel, repair, reconnaissance, and carrier decks. A point on the map could be a base. A base could become a lure. A lure could become a battle. For Japanese planners, Midway belonged to a broader effort. It was not an isolated raid launched merely to punish a remote American outpost. The plan was tied to continued expansion and to the strengthening of a defensive perimeter in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's larger operation aimed to draw U.S. carrier forces into a trap near Midway. If the American carriers could be brought out and destroyed, Japan's position across the Pacific would be stronger, and the line it had been building outward could be made more secure. There is a cold logic in that idea. A defensive perimeter sounds static, almost cautious, but in wartime, it can be built by offensive action. To secure a boundary, a navy may have to move beyond it. To protect earlier gains, it may seek new ones. In this sense, the Midway Plan carried both motion and consolidation inside it. Japan had advanced, and now it sought to shape the conditions under which the United States could respond. The target therefore had two meanings at once. Midway was a forward U.S. naval and air base between Hawaii and Japan, a place whose aircraft and patrol capability gave it value far beyond its small islands and reef. But it was also a point around which a larger naval design could be arranged. If the Japanese operation could threaten Midway, it might compel the United States Pacific Fleet to react. And if the American carriers reacted in the expected way, they might be caught. On the American side, the pressure was different but just as severe. The United States had to protect Hawaii. It had to defend what remained usable and vital after Pearl Harbor. It had to preserve its scarce carrier strength at a moment when every carrier mattered. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown were not interchangeable pieces on a board. They were the mobile striking power of a fleet adapting to a war in which carrier aviation had become central. That fact had become impossible to ignore. In the Pacific, the decisive weapon was no longer only the heavy gun of a battleship line. Aircraft launched from carriers could search across open ocean, strike at range, and reach an enemy before the ships themselves came within sight. The battle that was coming near Midway would be fought by naval forces, but its critical blows would come from the air. This was a carrier-centered war, and both sides understood that losing flight decks could change the balance of power. For Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the problem was not simply bravery or resolve. It was judgment under uncertainty. The United States could not afford to guess wrong. If the Japanese operation was misunderstood, American forces could be drawn out at the wrong time, toward the wrong place, or into danger without advantage. If the U.S. carriers were risked carelessly, the result could endanger Hawaii and weaken the American position across the Central Pacific. This is why the phrase 6 months after Pearl Harbor carries more than chronological meaning. It marks a moment before certainty. Later, Midway would be remembered as a major American naval victory, often taught as a turning point because it changed the carrier balance and helped halt Japan's early expansion across the Pacific. But that is not how it felt before the battle. Before the outcome, the direction of the war was unresolved. Japan was still advancing. The United States was still trying to read the next move correctly. The war room, in that moment, was not a place of clean hindsight. It was a place of partial information, risk, and consequence. The Japanese plan depended on movement, timing, and the expectation that U.S. carrier forces could be drawn into battle. The American response depended on identifying the target and placing scarce carriers where they could meet a larger Japanese operation on better terms. The difference between those two visions would be decided not only by pilots in the air, but by the interpretation of signals before the fleets closed. Midway's position made the problem sharper. Because it lay on the route between Hawaii and Japan, it connected geography to anxiety. If Japan could threaten or seize the initiative there, Hawaii's security became part of the calculation. If the United States could hold and use Midway, it remained a forward point of patrol and warning. The atoll's importance was therefore not sentimental. It was operational. It sat where distance, aircraft, and naval planning met. The emotional pressure on the American side was inseparable from Pearl Harbor, but it cannot be reduced to a desire for revenge. The more immediate question was survival and protection. How far could the fleet be pushed? How much could be risked? Which carriers were available, and where should they be placed? The Pacific Fleet had to fight without the luxury of abundance. A single carrier lost was not just one ship gone. It meant fewer aircraft at sea, fewer search patterns, fewer strike groups, fewer choices. Japan faced its own pressure, though of another kind. Its expansion created the need to defend what it had gained. The farther a perimeter stretched, the more important it became to anticipate enemy recovery and response. The Midway operation was part of that logic. Continue the advance, strengthen the perimeter, and seek a battle that could reduce American carrier power. In design, it tried to make American reaction predictable. In execution, it would depend on whether the United States was truly surprised. This is the quiet tension before the battle. Not yet the scream of dive bombers. Not yet the reports of incoming aircraft. Not yet the terrible losses of torpedo squadrons or the few minutes in which Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu would be struck. At this point in the story, the fleets are still moving toward decision. The larger strategic forces are already in motion, but the outcome is not written. The Japanese operation is coming forward. The American carriers must be placed with care. Midway is the hinge, but the hinge has not yet turned. To understand this moment, it helps to resist the comfort of inevitability. Midway was not destined to become the place where Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and the United States lost 1. It became that place through decisions made under pressure, through intelligence work, through flight operations, through chance, timing, and sacrifice. Before the battle, it was still possible to imagine a different result. That uncertainty is what gives the timeline its force. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States was not simply answering the past. It was trying to prevent the next disaster. Japan was not simply repeating its earlier success. It was trying to extend the logic of expansion into a stronger defensive position. Between those aims lay Midway, small in land, large in consequence, and now central to the next movement of the Pacific War. The decisive question, then, was not only who had more ships or who would strike first. It was who understood the coming move more clearly. Somewhere beneath the surface of the oceanic war, messages were being sent, intercepted, broken into fragments, argued over, and turned into operational judgment. Before carriers could be positioned northeast of Midway, before Point Luck could matter, before Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown could wait beyond the horizon, the United States had to know where to look. That knowledge would come not from a lookout's binoculars, but from the long, patient labor of code breakers listening through the static of the Pacific. The knowledge that would bring Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown toward the right ocean did not arrive as a single revelation. It came in pieces, through static, repetition, delay, and doubt. Before Midway became a battle of aircraft climbing into sunlight, it was a battle of messages passing unseen across the Pacific. This was the Code War beneath the ocean, not beneath the water in the literal sense of submarines alone, but beneath the visible surface of fleets and islands. It happened in radio intercept stations, intelligence offices, and plotting rooms. It happened where men listened for patterns inside traffic they were not meant to understand. It happened where a fragment of a Japanese naval message could be written down, compared, reconsidered, and placed beside other fragments until a shape began to emerge. That distinction matters. Code breaking was not magic. It was not a locked door suddenly opened by one brilliant guess. It was labor. It was patience. It was the accumulation of small certainties and the management of large uncertainties. At the center of the American effort in Hawaii was Station Hypo, where Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked against Japanese naval communications. Rochefort was one of the key figures in the intelligence story before Midway, not because he could simply read everything Japan sent, but because his station helped turn imperfect information into usable judgment. Nearby in the chain of command, Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton also became a crucial figure. Layton's role mattered because intelligence does not become strategy by existing in a file. It has to be interpreted, argued for, and brought to the commander who must decide what risks to take. That commander was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Nimitz did not have unlimited ships to move across the board. He did not have the luxury of being wrong in a quiet way. The American carrier force in the Pacific was scarce and precious. If he placed it in the wrong ocean, the Japanese operation could unfold with far less interference. If he held it back too cautiously, Midway might be left exposed. If he sent it forward without sufficient confidence, he risked losing the very carrier strength the United States needed to preserve. Intelligence could not remove that danger, but it could narrow the darkness. The Japanese Navy's communication system included JN-25, a major enciphered code system worked on by Allied cryptanalysts. It was not a simple substitution in which one letter replaced another. The system included a codebook of about 27,500 entries, with additive tables used to further encipher the groups. In practical terms, this meant that even when Allied cryptanalysts made progress, they were not reading Japanese naval traffic as if reading a newspaper. They were working through layers. They were reconstructing meaning from partial access, from repeated forms, from traffic patterns, from message headings, from timing, from known habits, and from the stubborn comparison of one intercept against another. A codebook entry might represent a word, a phrase, a place, an action, or a concept. Then the additive process obscured the code group further. To recover meaning, the codebreakers needed more than mathematical skill. They needed memory, context, filing discipline, and operational imagination. They needed to know what fleets had done before, what call signs had appeared, in what sequence, which messages seemed urgent, which routes made sense, and which possible targets matched the broader pattern of Japanese planning. The work was mechanical and human at the same time. Some parts could be organized into tables and records. Some parts depended on careful traffic analysis, who was communicating, how often, and under what conditions. Even without reading every word, the volume and direction of communications could suggest that something was moving. In wartime, traffic itself could become evidence. Silence could matter. A burst of messages could matter. A repeated designator could matter. The same encrypted world that was meant to conceal an operation could, by its own activity, begin to reveal that an operation existed. This is where the war room story becomes quieter, but not less dramatic. The drama is in a pencil mark beside a doubtful group. It is in the argument over whether a location designator points to one place or another. It is in the pressure of time, because an enemy operation at sea is not a theoretical problem. Ships are moving while analysts are still uncertain. Aircraft are being prepared while messages are still incomplete. The Pacific is too large for guesswork, but war rarely provides certainty. For Rochefort's team and for Leighton, the question was not simply whether Japan was planning another move. The larger question was where that move would fall. Midway had to be identified not as a possibility floating among many others, but as the target that deserved operational action. That was the step that could change Nimitz's choices. Without intelligence, Nimitz might have had to wait for Japanese forces to reveal themselves through patrol sightings or attacks already underway. By then, the time to position carriers advantageously might have passed. Carrier warfare rewarded those who could find first, launch first, and strike effectively. A force that arrived late to the right answer might still lose. The ocean did not forgive slow understanding. But if the Japanese target could be identified before the battle, then the American carriers did not have to sit passively near Hawaii, waiting for the next blow. They could be moved into a position where the Japanese operation might be met from an unexpected direction. This was the importance of intelligence at Midway. It did not sink carriers by itself. It did not fly the dive bombers. It did not spare the pilots from danger. But it helped put the American force where those later actions could matter. That is why the rooms behind the battle deserve attention. The men in them were not detached from the fighting. Their work was connected to every later movement, to the carriers steaming northeast of Midway, to the patrol aircraft lifting from the atoll, to the commanders measuring fuel, distance, and timing. A broken fragment in an intelligence room could become a line on a chart. A line on a chart could become a carrier position. A carrier position could become the difference between surprise and being surprised. This was also a contest of judgment. The American intelligence officers had to persuade operational command that the fragments meant something definite enough to act on. Nimitz had to decide how much weight to give that judgment. He was not being handed certainty. He was being handed a carefully built estimate, supported by code breaking, traffic analysis, and the experience of people who had spent long hours inside Japanese naval communications. The Japanese plan, associated with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's larger operation, depended in part on drawing American carrier forces into a trap near Midway. But intelligence altered the geometry of that trap. If Nimitz could anticipate the direction of the Japanese move, then the hunter might find itself entering waters where the intended prey was already waiting. That reversal did not happen in one dramatic instant. It came from the slow conversion of intercepted signals into operational confidence. It came from Station Hypo and from the intelligence channels that carried Rochefort's conclusions toward Leighton and Nimitz. It came from the recognition that the Japanese Navy's enciphered traffic, however difficult, was not silent. It left traces. In the cinematic memory of Midway, the eye naturally turns to flight decks, to aircraft engines, to wakes spreading behind carriers, to the sudden violence of the morning of June 4th, 1942. But before that morning, there was another kind of battle rhythm. The movement of paper, the sorting of intercepts, the comparison of groups, the effort to hear intention inside concealment. And in that rhythm, one unresolved designator became especially important. Japanese communications referred to a target known as AF. The question was simple to ask and difficult to prove. Where was AF? If AF was Midway, then the map would sharpen. If Midway could be confirmed as the target, Nimitz could move scarce carriers with a clearer purpose. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown could be positioned not as a defensive reflex, but as part of an ambush. The codebreakers had brought the Americans close to the answer. They had turned noise into pattern, and pattern into warning. But in war, a warning still needs a location. A code group still has to become a place with runways, reefs, water tanks, and men waiting under the Pacific sun. The next step would be almost startling in its plainness. Not a grand maneuver, not a technological miracle. A message about water. A small deception sent into the open, designed to make the hidden system answer back. The answer came through, something almost ordinary. After all the labor of Station Hypo, after the traffic analysis, the partial readings, the arguments over Japanese naval intentions, the uncertainty still rested on two letters, AF. Those letters appeared in Japanese communications as a target designator. They mattered because they were not yet a place. They were a shadow on the map, a point of interest inside an enemy plan whose full shape was still hidden. The Americans had reason to believe AF meant Midway. But reason was not the same as proof. In a war room, suspicion could guide attention, but it could not safely move carriers across the Pacific by itself. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had only a limited carrier force to work with. If the target was Midway, then the United States could act. If the target was somewhere else, then moving Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown toward the wrong patch of ocean could expose Hawaii, waste precious time, or leave the Japanese operation uncontested. So the problem became practical. How do you make an enemy code word reveal itself? The solution was not dramatic in appearance. It did not require a new machine, a sudden complete break into JN-25, or a captured order spread open on a table. It required a small deception, aimed at the habits of communication itself. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message reporting a water shortage. That is the kind of detail that can almost disappear inside a large battle. Water, not fuel, not carriers, not the movement of fleets, not the names Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, or Hiryu. Just water, the most basic concern on a small Pacific atoll. But precisely because it was mundane, it was useful. It was plausible. Midway was a forward naval and air base on an isolated atoll. Its people, aircraft, and facilities depended on supplies and working systems. A report about water would not sound like a grand strategic signal. It would sound like a local problem. The message was sent in the clear, uncoded. It was meant to be heard. Then the Americans waited for the hidden system to respond. In Japanese traffic that followed, the report appeared. AF was short of water. That was the moment the code word became a location. AF was not simply an abstract objective in enemy communications. AF was Midway. The Japanese system had taken the American bait, repeated the essential information in its own traffic, and tied the designation to the atoll. The intelligence problem had not vanished, but one of its most important uncertainties had been reduced. This is why the episode matters. It is easy, in hindsight, to turn the AF deception into a legend of cleverness, as if a single trick won a battle by itself. That is too simple. The deception worked because it stood on top of prior labor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and the team at Station Hypo had already been working through Japanese naval communications, fragments of JN-25, patterns in message traffic, and operational judgment. Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton was part of the chain by which that intelligence was carried into command consideration. The water message did not replace code breaking. It sharpened it. The mechanism was subtle but concrete. American intelligence believed that AF was probably Midway. Midway then sent an open message about a water shortage. Japanese communications later reported that AF was short of water. The closed enemy network had echoed the open American message while preserving the Japanese designator. In doing so, it connected the two. A code word had become a place with reefs, runways, fuel stores, aircraft, radios, and men under threat. In the atmosphere of a war room, that kind of confirmation changes the weight of every other piece of information. Before the confirmation, AF was a strong possibility. After it, Midway could be treated as the target. That did not mean the Americans knew everything. They did not possess perfect knowledge of every Japanese movement, every timing decision, or every tactical event that would unfold in early June 1942. But they now had the essential direction of the operation. The Japanese plan was aimed at Midway. For Nimitz, this was not an academic conclusion. It was the difference between reacting broadly and concentrating force. The United States could not cover the entire Pacific equally. It could not scatter its carriers everywhere and still expect them to be decisive anywhere. Carrier warfare depended on position, timing, reconnaissance, launch cycles, and the ability to strike before being struck. Intelligence mattered because it allowed a smaller force to be placed where it might have disproportionate effect. That is what the water message made possible. It helped turn uncertainty into an operational target. With Midway identified, American command could think in terms of ambush rather than mere defense. The carriers could be moved toward a waiting position northeast of Midway, associated with the phrase "Point Luck." From there, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown could be placed not on top of the atoll, but beyond it, in the ocean space where they might intercept the Japanese carrier force. This distinction mattered. Midway itself was important as a base, but the battle would not be decided only by guns on the islands or aircraft rising from its runways. The decisive struggle would depend on carriers finding carriers. If Japan expected to draw out American naval forces near Midway, then the American opportunity was to reverse the expectation, to have U.S. carriers already positioned, waiting beyond the horizon, informed by intelligence the Japanese did not know had been assembled. The deception about water therefore sits at the hinge between two kinds of war. On one side is the hidden war of messages, code groups, additive tables, partial readings, direction, inference, and doubt. On the other side is the visible war of flight decks, aircraft, fuel lines, bomb racks, and pilots climbing into the morning air. The AF confirmation connected them. It carried the work of Station Hypo and Layton's intelligence channel into the practical decisions of the Pacific Fleet. And its simplicity is part of its force. In a battle remembered for carrier decks exploding, torpedo planes flying low into disaster, and dive bombers arriving in a narrow window over the Japanese fleet, the confirming signal was about a shortage of water. A basic human and logistical need became an intelligence instrument. The atoll's vulnerability as a real place became the proof that the code word referred to that place. The Japanese did not announce, in plain language, the full outline of their operation. They did not need to. Their own traffic supplied the link. AF was short of water. For Rochefort's people, that phrase validated a conclusion already built from fragments. For Layton and the command staff, it strengthened the case that could be carried upward. For Nimitz, it helped justify one of the most consequential positioning decisions of the Pacific War. The American carriers were scarce. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were vital flight decks in a fleet still living in the shadow of Pearl Harbor. USS Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea and rushed back into service, a fact that made her presence at Midway all the more important. Every carrier counted because every carrier could launch aircraft, search ocean, defend itself, and strike enemy ships far beyond the range of naval guns. But carriers were also fragile concentrations of power. To send them forward was to risk them. Intelligence did not remove that risk. It made the risk intelligible. With Midway confirmed as AF, Nimitz could concentrate rather than disperse. He could position Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of the atoll, in the area remembered as Point Luck, with the expectation that the Japanese operation would come toward Midway. The Americans still had to find the enemy. They still had to launch effectively. They still had to survive the Japanese carrier force. Nothing in the water deception guaranteed victory. What it did was give the map a center. The Pacific remained enormous. The Japanese fleet remained dangerous. The coming battle would still depend on reconnaissance reports, weather, timing, command decisions, and the actions of air crews under extreme pressure. But one uncertainty had been forced into the open. AF was Midway. The target was no longer just a code group moving through intercepted traffic. It was a small atoll in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and the American carriers could now be sent to meet the operation moving toward it. A message about water had helped choose the battlefield. And once the battlefield was understood, the next question was where, exactly, to wait. Once the battlefield was understood, the next question was not dramatic in appearance. It was a matter of position. Where could a smaller American carrier force wait in the Central Pacific so that it was close enough to strike, but not so exposed that it could be found and destroyed first? Where could it sit beyond the horizon from Midway, hidden in the immense blue distances, yet ready to move when the Japanese operation came into reach? The answer became associated with a phrase that sounds almost too neat for war: Point Luck. It was not luck in the simple sense. It was not a guess thrown into the ocean. It was a calculated ambush position northeast of Midway, chosen because intelligence had narrowed the Japanese objective and because Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had decided to act on that intelligence. The work of Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo and the assessments of Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton and others had not handed Nimitz certainty, but it had given him something rare in naval war: a chance to be waiting near the place where the enemy expected to be the hunter. That difference mattered. At sea, a carrier task force is powerful, but it is also fragile in a particular way. Its strength is not in armor alone, or in the visible size of its hulls. Its true reach is in aircraft, fuel, pilots, deck crews, radios, scouting patterns, and timing. A carrier can strike far beyond the horizon, but only if it knows where to send its planes. It can vanish into the Pacific, but so can the enemy. The ocean that hides you also hides the force you need to find. Nimitz's problem was therefore not simply to send ships toward Midway. It was to place them where they could intercept a Japanese operation that was larger and dangerous, without wasting the one advantage American intelligence had created. The carriers sent into that risk were USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. Their names carried the weight of the early Pacific War. Enterprise and Hornet were part of the scarce carrier strength available to the United States after Pearl Harbor. Yorktown brought something more immediate and almost improbable. She had been damaged at Coral Sea and rushed back into service. Her return mattered because at Midway, every flight deck counted. A carrier was not just another ship in the formation. It was a floating airfield, a launch point, a recovery point, a storehouse of aircraft, ordnance, aviation fuel, trained crews, and command decisions. Losing one carrier from the order of battle did not mean losing one piece from a list. It meant losing reach. Yorktown's presence gave Nimitz a third carrier at the moment when three might still be barely enough. The repairs after Coral Sea did not make the risk disappear. They made the risk worth taking. Yorktown could put aircraft into the air. She could contribute searches, combat air patrol, strikes, and the complicated rhythm of flight operations that made carrier warfare possible. In a battle where the first force to locate the other carrier force might gain the decisive opening, an additional flight deck could mean additional aircraft, additional launch capacity, additional chances. And chances were what Nimitz had. Point Luck was the physical expression of that idea. It was the place where intelligence became deployment. The codebreakers and intelligence officers had helped identify Midway as the target. But a target is not yet an ambush. To make an ambush, Nimitz had to commit ships, crews, aircraft, and commanders to a patch of ocean chosen before the Japanese carriers appeared. He had to accept that the information was strong enough to act upon, but not perfect enough to remove danger. That is one of the quieter realities of command. Intelligence rarely arrives as a complete picture. It arrives as fragments, estimates, probabilities, and warnings. It may tell a commander where the enemy is likely to go, but not exactly when every aircraft will launch, not exactly where every ship will be at dawn, not exactly how weather will cover or reveal a formation, and not exactly which scout will see first. Nimitz could place Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway. He could use the intelligence gained from Japanese communications to avoid waiting blindly. He could make the Japanese plan meet an American concentration it did not expect in that way. But he could not make the Japanese carriers appear on schedule like marks on a classroom map. The Americans still had to find them. That task would fall into the practical machinery of carrier war. Patrol aircraft ranging over empty ocean, reports sent back through the air, commanders interpreting bearings and distances, flight decks turning into the wind, aircraft launching in groups, squadrons trying to navigate across sea and sky toward a moving enemy. A carrier battle was not a single blow delivered by certainty. It was a chain of searches and decisions, any one of which could fray. The position northeast of Midway offered concealment and opportunity, but it also demanded patience. The American carriers could not simply race into the middle of the Japanese advance without risking destruction. They had to remain beyond easy discovery until the moment came to strike. They had to be near enough to launch aircraft against the Japanese carrier force once it was found. They also had to be ready for the reverse. Japanese aircraft could find them first. This balance gives Point Luck its tension. The phrase can make the ambush sound clean, almost preordained. But nothing about the coming battle was clean from the viewpoint of the men who had to fight it. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were not sitting at the end of a solved equation. They were moving through a battle space filled with uncertainty, depending on intelligence that had shifted the odds but had not canceled the enemy's strength. The Japanese operation was still formidable. Its carrier force would include Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, commanded tactically by Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo. Those carriers were not passive targets moving toward an American trap. They carried experienced air groups and the same essential weapon that made the American carriers dangerous: aircraft able to search, attack, and destroy across distances that battleship-era commanders could not have controlled in the same way. This was why Nimitz's decision was both bold and restrained. He did not need to charge blindly westward. He needed to preserve his carriers long enough for their aircraft to matter. He needed them, waiting where the Japanese plan created an opening. He needed the base at Midway to remain part of the trap, drawing the Japanese operation toward the place intelligence had identified. Midway itself was not merely bait. It was a forward U.S. naval and air base with aircraft and patrol capability, and it sat on the route between Hawaii and Japan. Its airfields and patrol planes were part of the American ability to see outward into the Pacific. From that small atoll, reports could begin to shape the battle before the carrier planes ever arrived over the Japanese fleet. But the carriers were the sharp edge of the ambush. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown represented the mobile striking power Nimitz had to protect and spend at the same time. If he held them too far back, they might miss the moment. If he exposed them too early, they might be struck before launching effectively. If searches failed, aircraft could burn fuel over empty water. If launches were mistimed, squadrons could arrive separately, without the concentration that carrier warfare demanded. This is why the word luck in Point Luck should be heard carefully. Luck was not a substitute for intelligence. It was what remained after intelligence had done all it could. It was the weather over a search sector. It was the angle of a patrol aircraft's approach. It was whether a contact report reached a carrier in time to matter. It was whether a flight deck could launch under pressure. It was whether aircraft from different carriers, launched at different times, could find the same enemy force moving across the sea. Nimitz had not been given victory. He had been given the possibility of contact under favorable conditions. That possibility was precious enough to risk the carriers. In the war rooms and plotting spaces, the decision could be shown with lines and positions. Midway at the center, Japanese forces expected to approach, American carriers waiting to the northeast. On the ocean, it meant men on steel decks preparing aircraft before dawn. It meant crews handling bombs and torpedoes, pilots studying headings, Radio operators listening for reports, commanders knowing that the first reliable sighting might decide the shape of the day. Yorktown's presence added one more layer to that waiting. A ship damaged at Coral Sea had returned in time to stand beside Enterprise and Hornet. In a campaign where the United States could not afford waste, that hurried return was not a footnote. It was one of the reasons the American force at Point Luck was not 2 carriers, but 3. The additional deck widened the margin in a battle where margins were narrow. Still, the margin remained narrow. The American plan depended on finding the Japanese carrier force before it could destroy the American carriers. It depended on launching attacks effectively across long distances. It depended on surviving Japanese air power once the battle opened. The intelligence victory had set the stage, but aircraft would have to cross the stage in real time, with fuel gauges falling, formations separating, and enemy fighters waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Point Luck was therefore less a place of safety than a place of readiness. It was the quiet pause before movement. The ambush existed, but it had not yet been sprung. The carriers were in position, but the decisive enemy decks had not yet been struck. The ocean still concealed both sides. Then came the morning of June 4th, 1942. To the west and northwest of Midway, the Japanese carrier force moved toward its own mission. Its aircraft would rise first against the atoll. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were still hunters then, their flight decks alive with the opening blows of Nagumo's attack. And as Midway watched the sky darken with incoming planes, the question at Point Luck became urgent and simple. Could the hunters be found before they found the ambush? The hunters, for that brief morning, were still moving as if the trap belonged to them. West and northwest of Midway, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Japanese carrier force at the center of the operation's striking power. Around him were 4 fleet carriers whose names would soon become inseparable from the battle: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They were not supporting characters in a battleship drama. By June 4th, 1942, they were the heart of the fight. Their aircraft could reach across the horizon before heavy guns ever came within range. Their flight decks turned ocean into air power. That was the nature of Midway from Nagumo's side of the horizon. The Japanese operation had been designed to bring American strength out where it could be engaged. Midway itself was the visible objective, a small forward base in the Central Pacific. But the larger danger, for both sides, lay beyond sight. Somewhere in the Pacific, aircraft might be searching. Somewhere beyond the curve of the Earth, another carrier force might be preparing to launch. Nagumo's morning began inside that uncertainty. Japanese aircraft struck Midway before the decisive American carrier dive bomber attack. That sequence matters because it shows the battle before it became the famous 4-minute collapse. At first, the Japanese carriers were still projecting force outward. Their planes were in the air against the atoll. Midway was under attack. The Japanese carrier force had taken the initiative in the visible part of the battle. But a carrier that launches an attack does not become safer simply because its aircraft are away. It becomes part of a moving equation. Every carrier operation depends on timing. Aircraft must be launched, formed, sent toward a target, and recovered. Fuel is consumed. Weapons are selected and handled. Fighters are needed for protection. Scouts and patrols shape what commanders think they know. Reports arrive unevenly, sometimes late, sometimes incomplete, sometimes only as fragments that must be placed on a chart and judged against everything else already happening. That is why Nagumo's morning cannot be understood only as a moment of confidence or only as a moment of confusion. It was an operational problem, moving faster than any one man could freeze into certainty. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were powerful, but they were not invulnerable. Their strength depended on rhythm. A carrier force was most dangerous when its aircraft, crews, fuel, weapons, and information were aligned. It was most exposed when those elements were in motion and when the enemy's location was no longer a blank on the map. On the American side, the plan at Point Luck depended on finding these decks before they could find and strike the U.S. carriers. On the Japanese side, the same ocean concealed the American force. Midway was known. The atoll could be attacked. But carrier war was not decided by attacking land alone. The decisive question was whether the enemy's carrier decks could be located and whether aircraft could reach them at the right moment. This was the silent pressure under Nagumo's command. The 4 Japanese carriers formed the tactical spearhead of a much larger operation associated with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and the combined fleet. But at the point of contact, where aircraft rose and reports came in, Nagumo's force carried the immediate burden. It had to strike Midway, protect itself, and remain ready for the possibility that American carriers were not where Japanese planning expected them to be. That last possibility was the danger created by American intelligence. Nagumo did not need to know the full story of Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort, Edwin Layton, or the confirmation that AF was Midway for that danger to exist. The consequence was already on the ocean. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had placed Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway. The American carriers were not simply reacting from far away. They were waiting within operational reach. So while Japanese aircraft moved toward Midway, the battle's hidden structure was already taking shape. One set of aircraft was striking a known island base. Another force was searching the sea for the carriers that made the strike possible. Midway itself was both target and tripwire. An attack on the atoll would reveal direction, scale, and timing. Patrol aircraft from Midway could turn movement into reports. Reports could become bearings and distances. Bearings and distances could become launches. The Japanese carrier force was therefore strong and vulnerable at the same time. This is one of the central realities of carrier warfare in the Pacific. Power was no longer measured only by armor or gun caliber. It was measured by how quickly aircraft could be sent out and brought back, how accurately scouts could find an enemy, how effectively fighters could cover a fleet, and how rapidly commanders could act on information before it expired. The ocean was too large for certainty. Even a sighting was only a temporary truth unless it could be acted upon in time. Nagumo's 4 carriers embodied Japan's first-line carrier strength. Akagi had served as a flagship in the carrier force. Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu added the massive flight decks that made the morning attack possible. Together, they represented the kind of naval power that had defined Japan's early war expansion across the Pacific. At Midway, that same power was concentrated within reach of an American ambush. Yet nothing about the morning made the outcome inevitable. The American carriers still had to find the Japanese force. Their aircraft still had to launch across long distances of open water. Torpedo planes, dive bombers, fighters, and patrol aircraft all had their own limits. Navigation over the Pacific could turn a carefully planned strike into scattered formations. Fuel, weather, altitude, and timing could decide whether a squadron found a target or only empty sea. From Nagumo's side, the uncertainty was equally severe. The carriers had to manage the attack on Midway while remaining alert for a naval threat that might appear first as a message, then as a course correction, then as aircraft overhead. A commander at sea does not receive the battle as a clean story. He receives pieces: a report of aircraft, a sighting at a distance, a change in the sky, a demand from the flight deck, a need to protect the fleet now while preparing to strike something not yet fully known. That is what makes the morning so important. Before the famous dive bombers arrived, before Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit in the initial American carrier strikes, before Hiryu escaped that first blow and was found later, there was this compressed period when all 4 Japanese carriers were still functioning as hunters. Their aircraft had reached out toward Midway. Their force was moving through the ocean as the offensive edge of the Japanese plan. But the plan was beginning to meet the battlefield that American intelligence had helped create. Midway was not only receiving the attack, it was watching. Its defenders, including Marine aircraft on the atoll, would face the incoming raid. Patrol aircraft were out over the water. The U.S. carriers northeast of the atoll were waiting for information that could turn concealment into action. On both sides, men in cockpits, plotting spaces, and command positions were bound to the same urgent problem: what is out there, where is it, and how soon can it strike? The answer would not arrive all at once. It would come as fragments from the sky. A patrol aircraft would see incoming Japanese planes and report them. Another report would point toward Japanese carriers and supporting vessels northwest of Midway. In the war room of the battle, the morning would begin to sharpen from fear into coordinates. The Japanese carriers were still beyond the horizon, still dangerous, still central. But they were no longer only an unseen force moving through the Pacific. They were about to be placed on the map. The answer began to arrive, not as certainty, but as a voice from the sky. Before the guns on Midway could speak, before the full violence of the morning broke over Sand Island and Eastern Island, American patrol aircraft were already out over the Pacific, searching the immense approaches west and northwest of the atoll. They were looking for the thing that all the earlier intelligence work had made possible to imagine, but not yet possible to see, the Japanese force itself. In a plotting room, an enemy fleet is never simply a fleet. It is first a line on a map, then a bearing, then a distance, then a question. Is it moving toward us? Is it a scout plane? Is it the main body? Is it the carrier striking force? How old is the report? How fast could we act before the information begins to decay? That morning, June 4th, 1942, those questions were no longer theoretical. The first warning from the air was not the sighting every American commander wanted most. It was not, at first, the Japanese carriers themselves. It was incoming aircraft. A U.S. patrol aircraft reported many planes heading toward Midway from bearing 320 degrees at a distance of about 150 miles. In plain language, the danger was coming from the northwest. The raid was in motion. The Japanese strike that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had launched from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu was no longer only an expected possibility in an intelligence estimate. It was airborne, organized, and closing the distance. That kind of report had a special weight because Midway was small. A bearing from Midway did not point to an abstract grid square. It pointed to the direction from which aircraft could reach the atoll, cross the reef line, and strike the runways and installations that made Midway useful as a forward base. Sand Island and Eastern Island were not large spaces into which a defender could disappear. Aircraft, fuel, ammunition, radio facilities, and men were concentrated on a few pieces of land surrounded by water and coral. So the report mattered at once. Many planes. Bearing 320 degrees. About 150 miles. Each part of that sentence changed the morning. Many planes meant this was not a lone reconnaissance contact. Bearing 320 degrees gave defenders a direction. About 150 miles gave them time, but not much. The sky to the northwest was no longer empty space. It had become a route. In the war room logic of Midway, this was the moment when anticipation began to harden into procedure. The warning could be passed. Fighters could be readied. Anti-aircraft crews could prepare. Commanders could understand that the Japanese attack on the atoll had begun its final approach. The attack was no longer hidden inside Yamamoto's larger plan. It was coming over the water, but the incoming raid also carried a deeper implication. Carrier aircraft do not appear from nowhere. If Japanese planes were approaching Midway from the northwest, then somewhere beyond that same horizon were the flight decks that had launched them. Somewhere out there were the carriers that Nimitz's forces needed to find. That was the greater problem. Defending Midway was urgent. Finding the Japanese carriers was decisive. The American ambush northeast of Midway depended on transforming intelligence into contact. Commander Joseph Rochefort's work at Station Hypo, Edwin Layton's estimates, the identification of AF as Midway, and the positioning of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown near the area associated with Point Luck had all created an opportunity. But an opportunity at sea is fragile. It still requires discovery. The ocean does not show its hand, simply because codebreakers have read part of the enemy's intention. On June 4th, the scouting aircraft supplied the next layer of truth. A PBY patrol aircraft reported 2 carriers and supporting vessels on bearing 320 degrees from Midway, at about 180 miles. Again, the direction was northwest. Again, the sighting turned the invisible into the plotted. But this report was different from the warning of incoming aircraft. It did not merely say that the enemy's air group was approaching. It suggested where part of the carrier force could be found. 2 carriers and supporting vessels, bearing 320 degrees, about 180 miles from Midway. For the men receiving and passing that information, the words would have been more than description. They were coordinates becoming decisions. A PBY was not a carrier dive bomber. It was not the weapon that would deliver the later decisive blow against the Japanese flight decks. But in this phase of the battle, the patrol aircraft performed one of the essential acts of naval warfare. It saw. In a carrier battle, sighting could be as important as gunnery had once been in an older age of battleships.
The side that found the other first could launch first, shape the tempo, and force the enemy to respond.
The report of carriers northwest of Midway did not solve every problem. It did not identify every ship in the Japanese force. It did not remove uncertainty about exact composition, movement, or timing. The battle was still full of friction. Reports from aircraft could be delayed, incomplete, or imprecise. A ship's position at the moment it was seen was not the same as its position by the time strike aircraft could reach it. The Pacific itself was moving under everyone. Ships steaming, aircraft flying, messages traveling, commanders interpreting. But the sighting mattered because it narrowed the world. Until that moment, the Japanese carrier force had existed for the Americans as a calculated threat moving somewhere beyond visual range. Now, at least part of it had been placed in relation to Midway, northwest, roughly 180 miles. This was close enough to explain the incoming air attack. It was also close enough to become a target. This is the quiet drama of the morning before the famous 4 minutes. It is not yet the image of dive bombers rolling over, or carriers burning, or the sudden collapse of Japanese striking power. It is the quieter machinery that had to work first. Patrol lines, radio transmissions, plotting boards, bearings, distances, and command judgment. In that machinery, language became action. A pilot or crew saw shapes against the sea and sent a report. A radio room received it. A plotting team marked it. Officers weighted against what they already knew: the expected approach of the Japanese operation, the attack on Midway, the location of American carriers to the northeast, and the need to strike before the Japanese carriers could strike them. The battle was becoming visible in layers. First, intelligence had suggested Midway was the target. Then Nimitz had placed the American carriers where they might ambush the Japanese operation. Then Nagumo's aircraft had risen to attack the atoll. Now American patrol aircraft were reporting both the incoming raid and the carrier force beyond it. This sequence matters because Midway was not won by a single miraculous event detached from everything around it. The later dive bomber attack would be sudden and devastating, but it emerged from a chain of earlier recognitions. The U.S. Navy had to know where to wait. Midway had to send patrol aircraft over the water. Those aircraft had to find and report. Commanders had to act on imperfect but vital information. A bearing of 320 degrees may sound cold. A distance of 150 miles or 180 miles may sound like a technical detail. But in the early morning over Midway, these numbers carried fear, urgency, and possibility. They told the defenders which part of the sky to watch. They told American commanders that the Japanese carriers were not a rumor. They were within reach of the unfolding battle. There is also a human scale inside these reports. Somewhere in a patrol aircraft, crews looked out across a vast surface of water and recognized motion where emptiness had been expected. Aircraft in formation, ships below. The enemy, not as an idea, but as a sighting. Their report crossed back toward Midway and entered the nervous system of the battle. From there, the message moved into the wider American response. Midway's defenders were no longer waiting for an attack that might come. They were facing one that was approaching. The carriers at sea were no longer waiting only on intelligence from the code rooms. They were receiving contact from the patrol line. Between the atoll and the American carrier task forces, awareness was spreading outward. For Nagumo's force, the reports meant something else, though not necessarily something immediately visible from his bridge. His carriers had begun the morning as the source of the blow against Midway. Their aircraft were already moving toward the island. But once American scouts began to locate the carrier force, the Japanese flight decks themselves entered the danger zone. The weapon had revealed the hand that held it. This did not make the Japanese carriers helpless. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu remained powerful ships with trained air groups and the ability to strike at long range. The morning was still uncertain. The American carriers still had to launch effectively. Their aircraft still had to find the enemy across open ocean. Midway's own defenders still had to survive the attack coming toward them. But the emotional balance of the battle had shifted. At dawn, the Japanese strike was an approaching threat. After the patrol reports, it was an approaching threat connected to a location. That connection was everything. In carrier warfare, to find the flight decks is to make the enemy vulnerable. The carriers were not only sending war across the water, they were now being hunted by the same process of search and report that their own operation depended upon. The warning from the sky, therefore, did two things at once. It alerted Midway to immediate danger, and it opened the path toward the larger decision at sea. The first report said the raid was coming. The second placed carriers and supporting vessels beyond the horizon. Together, they turned the morning from expectation into contact. Now the small forward base had to endure what was already on its way. On the ground at Midway, men looked toward the northwest. Aircraft rose or prepared to rise. Guns and crews waited. The air attack that had been plotted in bearing and distance would soon become engine noise, bomb bursts, smoke, and fragments of film captured by Navy cameramen and by John Ford's lens. The war room had its coordinates. The island was about to have the battle. And on Midway, that meant the war would no longer be measured only in bearings, distances, and radio reports. It would be measured in the seconds between a lookout's warning and the first explosions on land. It would be measured in aircraft climbing into the morning, in anti-aircraft crews tracking shapes against the sky, and in the strain placed on a small forward base that had suddenly become the target of carrier aviation. Midway was not a great fortress. It was an atoll in the Central Pacific, with Sand Island and Eastern Island carrying the weight of its military importance. But by June 4th, 1942, it was no longer merely a remote American outpost. It was a naval and air base directly in the path of Japan's operation. The Japanese strike approaching from the northwest was meant to hit that base hard enough to weaken it, suppress its aircraft, and prepare the way for the larger plan around Midway. The defenders knew the raid was coming because patrol aircraft had seen it. That early warning mattered. It gave Midway time, but only a little. Enough time for aircraft to get into the air. Enough time for guns to be manned. Enough time for men on the ground to understand that the reports from the sky were about to become physical reality. Among those who helped defend Midway were Marine Aircraft Group 22 and Marine Fighting Squadron 221. Their role places the island's defense inside the wider structure of American air power at the atoll. This was not a carrier deck able to maneuver across the ocean. It was fixed ground, surrounded by reef and water, and it had to absorb an attack from aircraft launched by some of the most dangerous carriers in the world. The defenders also faced a hard truth about equipment and timing. Midway had aircraft, but they were not all designed for the same mission, and not all were equal to the carrier aircraft coming against them. The American air presence at or near Midway included a wide range of types: SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBD Devastator torpedo planes, F-4F Wildcats, F-2A Buffalo fighters, PBY patrol aircraft, B-17 bombers, B-26 aircraft adapted for torpedoes, and TBF Avengers. That list can sound, at first, like strength, and in one sense it was. Midway had eyes, fighters, bombers, patrol aircraft, and attack planes. It could search, warn, intercept, and strike. But in another sense, the variety tells us how improvised and layered the defense really was. Different aircraft meant different speeds, different ranges, different weapons, different crews, and different ways of fighting. Some were meant to patrol vast stretches of ocean. Some were meant to dive steeply onto ships. Some were meant to deliver torpedoes at low altitude. Some were there to defend the island from incoming attack. A forward base did not defend itself with one clean instrument. It defended itself with everything available. The PBY patrol aircraft had already shown their importance before the bombs fell. They were the long eyes of Midway, ranging outward over the Pacific and turning open ocean into reported contact. One report warned of many planes heading toward Midway from bearing 320 degrees at a distance of about 150 miles. Another placed carriers and supporting vessels on the same bearing, farther out, at about 180 miles. Those were not abstract numbers to the defenders. They were the difference between surprise and readiness. But warning did not stop the raid. As Japanese aircraft came in, Midway's defense became layered. Fighters rose to meet the attackers. Anti-aircraft guns on the islands added their own fire from below. Aircraft that could be launched were sent out or prepared for missions of their own. The island had to protect itself while also remaining part of the larger American plan to find and strike the Japanese carriers beyond the horizon. That was the central pressure of the morning. Midway was both a target and a base for counterattack. It had to survive the blow, but it also had to keep functioning as a platform in a carrier battle that extended far beyond sight of land. Marine Fighting Squadron 221 stood in the path of the incoming raid. The squadron's fighters were part of the immediate air defense, climbing into a sky that was already being shaped by the Japanese attack plan. The presence of F-4F Wildcats and F-2A Buffalo fighters at Midway reminds us that the island defense was not a single uniform force. It included aircraft with different capabilities, operating under urgent conditions against a carrier air group that had crossed the sea to strike precisely this place. On the ground, Marine Aircraft Group 22 and the other defenders faced the effects of carrier warfare in its most direct form. A carrier could remain beyond the horizon, unseen from the island, while its aircraft delivered violence onto runways, facilities, fuel, guns, and men. This was the new geometry of Pacific War. The ship did not have to appear offshore. Its reach arrived first. For the Japanese, the Midway strike was part of a sequence. Hit the island, reduce its danger. Continue the operation that was intended to draw out American carrier forces and extend Japan's defensive perimeter. But the American warning system, the patrol aircraft, and the readiness of Midway complicated that sequence. The island was not passive. It had aircraft in the air and aircraft available for strikes of its own. Its defenders were not merely waiting to be bombed. They were tied into a larger network of search, reporting, and response. That is why the aircraft list matters. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBD Devastator torpedo planes were associated with ways of attacking ships at sea. The B-17 bombers represented another kind of long-range striking power. The B-26 aircraft adapted for torpedoes and the TBF Avengers pointed to the effort to put torpedoes into the fight from land-based aircraft as well as from carriers. The PBY patrol aircraft held the scouting line. The Wildcats and Buffalo fighters formed part of the defensive shield. None of this made Midway invulnerable. It made Midway active. The island could see, report, launch, intercept, and endure. Its defense was not the defense of a wall. It was the defense of a node in a vast ocean battle, a fixed point connected by radio to aircraft above the sea, and commanders trying to turn information into action. And as the bombs fell and the guns fired, the battle was also being recorded. John Ford was at Midway, along with U.S. Navy cameramen, filming wartime footage on 16mm Kodachrome. Some of that footage would later be used in the film The Battle of Midway, released in 1942. The presence of cameras does not soften the event. It sharpens it. It reminds us that this was not only reconstructed afterward from charts and reports. Parts of the attack were witnessed through lenses as they unfolded, in color, by men standing inside the danger. The camera could not capture the entire battle. It could not show every aircraft over the horizon or every decision in a plotting room. But it caught fragments of a forward base under attack. Smoke, movement, faces, the strange closeness of war when it comes to a small island in a very large ocean. For American audiences later that year, those images helped connect a remote Pacific battle to the home front. For us, they remain a reminder that Midway was both strategic and immediate. It was a map problem, and it was fire on the ground. The Japanese air attack on Midway did not decide the battle by itself. The decisive destruction of the Japanese carriers still lay ahead. But the attack on the island shaped the morning. It forced the defenders into action. It confirmed that Nagumo's carriers were not simply a distant threat. They were already projecting power onto the atoll. It also kept the American command under pressure to respond before the Japanese operation could unfold on its own terms. Midway had been found by the enemy, but the enemy had also been reported by Midway's patrol aircraft. That exchange mattered. The island was struck, but it was not blinded. It was attacked, but it remained part of the fight. Beyond the horizon, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were now moving from readiness into action. The coordinates gathered by patrol aircraft and the danger revealed by the attack on Midway were feeding into the next phase of the morning. Carrier decks would begin sending aircraft into the sky. Searches would become launches. Launches would become formations. And somewhere northwest of the atoll, the Japanese carriers that had sent their aircraft against Midway would have to be found. Beyond the horizon, the American carriers were entering the part of the battle that looked, from a distance, almost orderly. Flight decks turned into the wind. Engines warmed. Aircraft were spotted, armed, checked, and sent forward into the morning. But carrier warfare in June of 1942 was never as clean as the arrows later drawn on a map. It was a sequence of difficult acts performed across empty ocean. First, someone had to search. Then someone had to report. Then commanders had to decide whether the contact was reliable enough, close enough, and important enough to justify launching aircraft that could not be called back easily once committed. After that came the launch itself, aircraft rising one after another from a moving deck, forming up in the air, trying to gather into squadrons and groups while fuel burned and the target remained somewhere beyond sight. Point luck had done its work only up to a point. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had placed USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown northeast of Midway because intelligence had made that position possible. Commander Joseph Rochefort's work at Station Hypo, Edwin Layton's judgment in fleet intelligence, and the confirmation that AF meant Midway had all helped move the American carriers into the path of the Japanese operation. But intelligence could not steer a dive bomber through cloud, wind, distance, and uncertainty. It could not guarantee that squadrons launched from different carriers would find the same patch of sea at the same hour. Being in the right general area was not the same as finding Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. That was the tension now. Midway had been attacked. Patrol aircraft had reported Japanese carriers and supporting vessels northwest of the atoll. The enemy was no longer an abstraction. Somewhere out there, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force was operating, recovering aircraft, preparing for the next decision, and remaining dangerous. For the American carriers, the time for waiting had narrowed. Enterprise and Hornet began launching attacks around 700 in the morning. The detail sounds simple, almost administrative. Launch around 700. But inside that phrase was the physical reality of naval aviation. On a carrier deck, aircraft were not just aircraft. They were payload, fuel, crew, risk, and timing. Some were meant to attack at low altitude with torpedoes. Some were meant to climb and come down in steep dives. Fighters had their own tasks, their own range limits, their own problems of escort and protection. The air group was not a single weapon. It was a collection of weapons that worked best when they arrived together, from different directions and altitudes, against a target whose defenses were stretched. That kind of coordination was fragile. It depended on headings, speeds, weather, recognition, radio discipline, and luck. It depended on aircraft with different performance finding each other in the sky. It depended on a common target being where it was expected to be when they arrived. And in the Central Pacific, the ocean itself worked against certainty. There were no roads to follow, no landmarks once the carriers and Midway fell behind the horizon. The battlefield was a moving emptiness, measured by bearing, distance, estimated speed, and the amount of fuel still in the tanks. Enterprise and Hornet launched into that emptiness. From their decks rose aircraft representing the new character of the Pacific War. The battle was not being decided by battleship lines closing for gunfire. It was being decided by scouts, flight decks, and naval aviators who might never see the ship that had launched them again until they returned, low on fuel, searching for a small moving deck on a vast sea. The American aircraft that morning included types already connected to the fight around Midway: SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBD Devastator torpedo planes, F-4F Wildcats, and other aircraft operating from Midway itself or in the wider battle area, including PBY patrol aircraft, B-17 bombers, B-26 aircraft adapted for torpedoes, and TBF Avengers. Each type belonged to a different idea of how to reach the enemy. Patrol aircraft found. Bombers searched and struck. Torpedo planes had to come in low, close, and exposed. Dive bombers needed altitude, position, and a target below them at the decisive instant. The challenge was not merely to launch them. It was to bring their different methods into one battle at the right moment. That was much easier to imagine in a planning room than to achieve over the Pacific. A torpedo plane flying low could not move like a dive bomber climbing high. Fighters could not escort everyone everywhere, forever. A strike group might separate in weather or in the effort to conserve fuel. One formation might find the enemy, another might not. A squadron might arrive too early, unsupported. Another might arrive too late, after the enemy had turned, launched, recovered, or vanished beneath cloud and distance. So the morning became a race between information and motion. The PBY report had given the Americans a direction and an approximate location for Japanese carriers northwest of Midway. But a carrier force was not fixed ground. Nagumo's ships were moving. The American carriers were moving too. Aircraft launched from Enterprise and Hornet had to fly not to a point, but to an estimate of where an enemy force would be after time had passed. Every minute mattered, not only because of what was happening on the Japanese decks, but because every minute in the air changed the fuel state and the geometry of the attack. This is the quieter suspense behind the famous minutes that would come later. Before the dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers, before the names Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became tied to the sudden catastrophe of the late morning, there was this less visible phase, men launching into uncertainty, commanders choosing to commit scarce aircraft, formations trying to assemble over a sea that offered no guidance. Yorktown began launching later in the morning. Her presence still carried the meaning it had carried since she left Pearl Harbor after emergency repair. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea and rushed back into service. At Midway, that meant Nimitz had a third flight deck. It meant more aircraft could be put into the search and strike effort. It meant the American carrier force, still smaller than the Japanese operation it was trying to ambush, had one more chance to concentrate power at the critical place. But Yorktown's later launch also reminds us that the American response did not leave the decks as one perfectly synchronized wave. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were separate ships operating in the same battle but not fused into a single machine. Their aircraft departed at different times. Their squadrons faced different routes and different problems. The entire system depended on finding Nagumo's carriers and arriving with enough force to matter. If the strike scattered, if they missed, if they arrived piecemeal against prepared defenses, the advantage created by intelligence could be spent without result. That was the danger. The American commanders had the broad outline right. Midway was the target. Japanese carriers were in the area. U.S. carriers had been placed northeast of the atoll to intercept them. But the battle would not be won by the broad outline. It would be won or lost in the hard mechanics of carrier aviation. The launch order, the climb, the heading, the search leg, the fuel calculation, the formation that held together or did not. The pilots and air crews leaving Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were crossing from the world of command into the world of execution. Behind them were the carrier bridges, plotting boards, radio rooms, and decks that had sent them out. Ahead of them was the Japanese carrier force, somewhere over the curve of the horizon. And between those 2 points lay the real battlefield. There was no guarantee that the American aircraft would find Nagumo. There was no guarantee they would find him at a vulnerable moment. A carrier force at sea could be deadly, even when surprised, and Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire would soon make that clear. The Americans were not launching into an empty contest of charts. They were flying toward one of the most capable carrier forces in the world, one that had already struck Midway that morning and still held the power to strike back. The morning, then, was not a simple march toward inevitability. It was a narrowing corridor of chances. Nimitz had not conjured certainty. He had created an opportunity. The carriers at Point Luck now had to convert that opportunity into contact, and contact into attack. Enterprise and Hornet had begun sending their aircraft out around 700. Yorktown followed later in the morning. Across the water, the separate pieces of American carrier aviation were reaching outward, torpedo planes low, dive bombers higher, fighters tasked with protection where they could provide it, all of them bound by distance and time. Some would not find the target. Some would find it under terrible conditions. Some would arrive without the support they needed. That is where the story now begins to darken. Before the famous dive bomber strike, before the 4-minute image that gives this battle its sharpest memory, American torpedo squadrons would come in low over the water against Japanese carriers and their defenses. Their attacks would not deliver the decisive destruction, but they would become part of the sequence that shaped the moment when destruction finally came. For now, the aircraft were in the air, the ocean was still hiding the enemy, and the American plan depended on men flying toward a target they had not yet seen. The aircraft that had left the American carriers were now spread across a vast and unforgiving emptiness. From above, the Pacific could look almost featureless, a blue surface broken only by cloud shadows and the thin white lines of wakes. But for the men in the torpedo planes, there was no abstraction. They were flying low, slow, and exposed toward a Japanese carrier force protected by speed, guns, and fighters. This was the part of the battle that later memory can sometimes rush past. The famous image of Midway is the sudden fall of dive bombers from altitude, the strike that seemed to arrive at the exact instant when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. But that moment did not appear out of nowhere. Before it, American torpedo squadrons came in at low altitude against Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their job was among the most dangerous in carrier aviation: approach close enough, straight enough, and low enough to release a torpedo against a maneuvering warship. A dive bomber could fall from height and then pull away after release. A torpedo plane had to make its attack near the water. It had to close the range. It had to hold a line long enough for the weapon to enter the sea properly. Against a carrier task force, that meant entering a zone where Japanese combat air patrol fighters could descend on them and where ships below could turn their anti-aircraft fire toward the incoming threat. The American torpedo aircraft at Midway included the TBD Devastator, already an aging machine in a war that was changing faster than weapons could be replaced. These crews knew they were part of a combined carrier attack. In theory, torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters could arrive in coordination, forcing an enemy carrier force to defend against threats from different directions and altitudes at the same time. In practice, on the morning of June 4th, 1942, coordination was fragile. Distance, navigation, weather, timing, radio limitations, and the simple vastness of the ocean pulled formations apart. Some American aircraft would not find the enemy. Some would find the Japanese carriers without the support they needed. Some would arrive at the target alone. The most searing example came from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet pressed its attack without support. 15 aircraft went in against the Japanese carrier force. None of those aircraft returned to Hornet. Of the carrier-based VT-8 attack, Ensign George H. Gay was the sole surviving pilot. That fact should be allowed to stand for a moment. 15 aircraft launched from an American carrier in the morning. None came back. A squadron that had been part of a carefully assembled carrier air group was, in the space of one attack, destroyed as a fighting unit. The names and faces behind that loss belonged to young men flying into one of the most lethal tactical situations of the Pacific War: low altitude, limited speed, little protection, and an enemy force whose fighters and gunners had the advantage of position. Ensign George H. Gay survived in the water. Around him, the battle continued. Above him, the Japanese carriers were still alive. Their decks, their aircraft, their crews, and their commanders remained inside a rapidly changing morning. It is important to be careful here, because the story of the torpedo squadrons can be distorted by the need to make every sacrifice visibly decisive. The torpedo attacks did not produce the famous destruction of the Japanese carriers. They did not sink Akagi, Kaga, or Soryu in those low-level runs. The decisive carrier damage would come from dive bombers arriving from above, within a narrow window later that morning. But to say the torpedo attacks did not deliver the decisive blow is not to say they did not matter. They mattered because battle is not only the instant of impact. It is also the timing before impact, the attention drawn away, the formation broken, the fighter altitude changed, the commander forced to respond, the minute lost, and then another. The American torpedo squadrons attacked in a way that demanded reaction. Japanese fighters were drawn downward toward the low-flying torpedo planes. The carrier force had to maneuver under threat. The morning became less orderly, more compressed, more urgent. This is the difficult causation of Midway World War. The torpedo squadrons did not cause the destruction in a simple, direct line. They were not the weapon that set the Japanese carriers burning, but their attacks shaped the conditions into which the later dive bombers arrived. They helped disrupt Japanese timing. They helped pull combat air patrol attention toward the surface of the sea. They became part of the chain of pressure bearing down on Nagumo's force. War room maps often show arrows converging neatly on a target. The torpedo attacks were not neat. They were human beings arriving in scattered sequence, often without the protection that doctrine and planning would have wanted for them. Their courage was not that they flew in a perfectly coordinated strike. Their courage was that they continued when coordination had failed. In a carrier battle, altitude could decide the kind of danger a crew faced. High above, a dive bomber crew searched for ships that looked small against the ocean and then committed to a steep, violent descent. Low over the water, a torpedo crew lived inside a narrowing corridor. Every mile closer made the target larger, but also made escape less likely. The Japanese ships could turn. Fighters could attack from above and behind. The torpedo plane had to keep coming. That is why the phrase low-altitude sacrifice is not just poetic. It describes a tactical reality. These crews did not have the safety of speed or height. They attacked from the level where the sea itself filled the windshield, where the carrier ahead was not a symbol on a chart, but a moving steel target guarded by an entire fleet. By this point in the morning, Nagumo's carriers had already launched against Midway. American patrol aircraft had already reported Japanese ships northwest of the atoll. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had already begun sending their air groups outward. All of those decisions, searches, and launches were now converging in uneven pieces over the Japanese carrier force. The torpedo squadrons were among the first American carrier aircraft to arrive in that deadly space. They arrived before the famous 4-minute strike. They arrived at a time when the Japanese carriers were still able to defend themselves with fighters and shipboard fire. They arrived low enough to be seen, engaged, and overwhelmed. For the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, the cost was almost total. Hornet's 15 torpedo aircraft in that attack did not return. Ensign George H. Gay's survival made him a witness to a loss that could otherwise have vanished into the sea. His survival also helps fix the scale of the sacrifice in memory, not as a statistic alone, but as a squadron reduced to one surviving pilot from that carrier-based attack. And yet, above that same ocean, other American aircraft were still searching, still closing, still trying to find the carriers that had seemed so difficult to locate only hours before. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were moving toward the moment that would give Midway its most compressed and dramatic image. They would arrive not into a calm sky, but into a battle already disturbed by failed coordination, desperate attacks, evasive maneuvering, and fighters pulled down toward the water. The low-flying torpedo planes had not delivered the decisive destruction, but they had helped make the sky over Nagumo's force a different place. The Japanese carriers were still there. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were still afloat. The decisive fires had not yet begun, but the morning had been bent out of shape. The cost had already been paid in aircraft and lives. And high above, the next American attackers were nearing the point where altitude, timing, fuel, decks, and chance would meet in a few terrible minutes. Above Nagumo's force, the battle was changing shape again. The low attacks had come in along the surface of the sea, through anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, and they had left wreckage behind them. Now the decisive threat was arriving from altitude. The American dive bombers were not coming in as part of a perfectly synchronized machine. They were arriving after confusion, searching, fuel anxiety, and the broken timing that marked carrier warfare across open ocean. But in the late morning of June 4th, 1942, those imperfections converged with something the American pilots needed more than anything else. They found the Japanese carriers. In the Naval History and Heritage Command timeline material, the central strike falls into a narrow band of time, about 10:22 to 10:26 in the morning. 4 minutes. It is one of the most famous compressions in American naval history, but it has to be handled carefully. The Battle of Midway did not end in those 4 minutes. Hiryu was not destroyed in the first attack. Yorktown would still suffer badly. The fight would continue, and men on both sides would keep searching, launching, attacking, and dying. Still, those minutes changed the tactical situation with extraordinary speed. Before the dive bombers came down, Nagumo's carrier force still had 4 fleet carriers in the fight: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They were the core of the Japanese striking power near Midway. They were the mobile airfields that made the operation dangerous, not only to the atoll, but to the American carriers northeast of it. Their aircraft had already attacked Midway that morning. Their presence meant that Japanese carrier aviation remained the immediate threat around which every American decision revolved. Then the SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived. A dive bombing attack was an act of controlled descent. The aircraft approached from altitude, rolled into a steep dive, and converted height into speed and aim. In theory, the method allowed a pilot to place a bomb more accurately on a moving ship than level bombing from high altitude could usually manage. In practice, it demanded nerve, timing, and a target that remained within the line of attack while the aircraft plunged toward anti-aircraft fire and the surface of the sea. Against an aircraft carrier, the method could be devastating. A carrier's strength was also its vulnerability. The flight deck was not just an open platform. It was the working surface of an entire system. Aircraft had to be parked, fueled, armed, warmed up, launched, recovered, and moved. Fuel lines, bombs, torpedoes, aircraft, maintenance crews, and deck crews all belonged to the living machinery of carrier warfare. When that machinery was caught at the wrong moment, a bomb hit could do more than punch a hole. It could ignite fuel, detonate ordnance, and turn the flight deck from a place of launch into a trap of fire and smoke. That is why timing mattered. The American torpedo squadrons had not sunk the carriers. Their attacks had come in low and had suffered terrible losses. But their approach had helped pull Japanese attention and fighters downward. Their sacrifice belonged to the sequence, not as a simple cause that can explain everything, but as part of the disturbed air battle into which the dive bombers arrived. Nagumo's force had been maneuvering, defending, and responding. The morning had become crowded with pressures. Now the attack came from above. Enterprise and Yorktown dive bombers struck the Japanese carrier force at about 10:22 to 10:26 in the morning. In the initial dive bomber strikes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit. Within minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were transformed from instruments of offensive power into burning, crippled ships. Kaga was hit. Soryu was hit. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit. The names matter because they were not symbols on a map. They were flight decks, air groups, command spaces, crews, and fuel-fed systems of naval air power. Only a short time before, they had represented the striking arm of a Japanese operation designed to draw out and destroy American carrier strength near Midway. Now, 3 of the 4 central carriers had been struck in the space of minutes. This was the heart of the Midway story, but not because it was simple. It is tempting to imagine the scene as if history suddenly became clean, the right aircraft at the right height over the right ships, and then the battle was decided. The reality was harsher and more complicated. The American attack had followed misdirection, separated formations, low-altitude losses, and the difficult problem of finding a fleet at sea. The Japanese carriers had already been under strain from the morning's operations. The American torpedo planes had already paid a terrible price. The dive bombers did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived at the end of a chain of decisions and accidents that stretched from the intelligence rooms ashore to the flight decks northeast of Midway, and from the patrol reports over the Pacific to the Japanese carriers maneuvering under attack. But there is still no need to drain the moment of its force. For a carrier force, minutes could contain catastrophe. A battleship might absorb damage and continue to fight with its guns. A carrier depended on the delicate cycle of aviation. If the deck was wrecked, if fires spread, if aircraft and fuel burned together, if crews could not launch or recover planes, then the ship's function could collapse even while the hull still floated. Carrier warfare made time more fragile. It turned a few hits at the wrong moment into a disaster that radiated through the entire operation. That is what happened to Nagumo's force in those minutes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were not merely damaged in isolation. Their destruction of usefulness shattered the offensive weight of the Japanese carrier formation. Before the attack, Nagumo's force could still threaten the American carriers with multiple flight decks. After the attack, only Hiryu had escaped the first blow. The tactical balance had been violently altered. The United States had not ended the battle, but it had stripped away 3/4 of the Japanese carrier striking force at the center of the morning. The wider consequences would unfold over hours and days. Japan would lose 4 aircraft carriers at Midway. The United States would lose 1 carrier and 1 destroyer. The Japanese loss of first-line carrier strength would weaken its ability to sustain the kind of offensive momentum that had marked the early Pacific War. But in the immediate moment, the meaning was more urgent and more local. The American carriers had survived long enough to strike.
The Japanese carriers had been found, and 3 of them were now burning. The phrase 4 minutes endures because it captures the shock of compression. It gives shape to a battle that was otherwise spread across vast distances and uncertain reports. From the war rooms and plotting tables, Midway had been an intelligence problem. From the carriers, it had been a problem of launch cycles, bearings, range, fuel, formation, and weather. From the cockpits, it had been a search over empty ocean and then a sudden descent toward ships below. The 4 minutes do not replace that complexity. They reveal how all of it could converge. There is also a moral danger in making the moment too neat. If the 4 minutes are treated as if they alone explain Midway, the story loses the men who came before them, the codebreakers who helped identify the target, the patrol aircraft that found and reported Japanese forces, the carrier crews who launched under uncertainty, the torpedo squadrons that attacked at low altitude and were cut down. It also loses the men who would come after them, because Hiryu was still alive. That fact matters. Hiryu escaped the first attack. While Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Hiryu remained capable of action. One surviving Japanese carrier could still launch aircraft, still find an enemy, still impose a price. The battle's famous center had passed, but the danger had not. The American victory was not yet secure. Carrier warfare punished anyone who assumed that a damaged enemy was already finished. For the Americans, the sight of 3 Japanese carriers struck would later become the defining image of Midway's reversal. For the Japanese, those same minutes were a disaster that unfolded with almost unbearable speed. A force that had come toward Midway as part of a larger operation to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and draw out American carriers had suddenly lost the core of its offensive strength. The sky above the carriers had done what the war rooms could only make possible. Intelligence had placed the American carriers in position. Patrols and reports had helped uncover the enemy. Launches had sent aircraft into the morning. Sacrifice had bent the fight out of shape. Then, between about 10:22 and 10:26, Enterprise and Yorktown dive bombers struck, and Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit. 4 minutes did not end the Pacific War. They did not even end the Battle of Midway. But they changed what the battle was. Before them, Nagumo's carrier force remained a deadly and coherent threat. After them, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning, and the initiative that Japan had carried across the Pacific was suddenly in question. Only Hiryu remained to answer. And from that surviving flight deck, the next blow would come back toward the Americans, toward the carrier, whose rushed return from Coral Sea had helped make the ambush possible, USS Yorktown. The fires on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu did not silence the ocean. They changed it. They tore the center out of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's striking force, and they turned a Japanese operation built around confidence, reach, and carrier air power into a crisis of survival. But the Battle of Midway was not over in those 4 minutes. One Japanese flight deck had escaped the first American dive bomber attack. Hiryu was still afloat. Hiryu still had aircraft. And in a carrier battle, a surviving deck was not a detail. It was a weapon. That is why the next movement of the battle matters so much. The famous moment between about 10:22 and 10:26 in the morning on June 4th, 1942 can make Midway sound almost instantaneous, as if the outcome was settled the moment American dive bombers came down through the clouds. In one sense, the battle had been transformed. 3 of Japan's 4 central carriers had been hit. The carefully built striking power that had crossed the Pacific was burning in separate columns of smoke. But Hiryu had not been hit in that first attack. The 4th carrier's survival kept the battle alive. It meant that Japanese carrier aviation, even wounded, could still reach back across the water. It meant that the American carriers northeast of Midway were not just attackers now. They were targets. The same logic that had made Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu vulnerable now turned toward USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. Flight decks were the decisive ground of this battle, even though the ground itself was steel, moving across the sea. And among the American carriers, Yorktown carried a particular weight. Yorktown should not have been an easy presence to take for granted. The ship had been damaged at Coral Sea and rushed back into service before Midway. In the compressed calendar of the Pacific War, that mattered. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had few carriers to use.
Every flight deck counted. Enterprise and Hornet were already central to the ambush position northeast of Midway, but Yorktown gave the United States a third carrier at the decisive place and hour. That third deck had helped make the American blow possible. Yorktown's aircraft had joined the strike that hit the Japanese carrier force. Yorktown's presence had increased the reach, mass, and resilience of the American force. In the war rooms and plotting spaces where Midway had been built from intelligence, risk, and timing, Yorktown was not just another ship name. It was the result of urgency made physical, a damaged carrier brought back because the United States could not afford to wait. Now that same carrier was about to pay for being there. From Hiryu, Japanese aircraft struck back at Yorktown on June 4th. The ship that had survived Coral Sea, the ship that had been made ready in haste, the ship whose air group had helped deliver the decisive blow against Nagumo's force, became the focus of Japan's remaining carrier air power. Yorktown was badly damaged. In the structure of the battle, this is the point where the story resists simplicity. Midway was a U.S. victory. The intelligence work of Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo, Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton, and others had helped Admiral Nimitz place American carriers where they could meet the Japanese operation. Patrol aircraft had found the incoming threat. Torpedo squadrons had attacked at terrible cost. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had struck 3 Japanese carriers in minutes. And still, a surviving Japanese carrier could alter the battle. Hiryu's counterattack showed that carrier warfare did not end when one side suffered a spectacular wound. As long as aircraft could be armed, launched, and guided toward an enemy force, danger remained. A carrier battle was not only a matter of who struck first. It was a contest of scouting, deck cycles, damage control, fuel, ordnance, fighter defense, and timing. One surviving flight deck could still force the enemy to absorb punishment. One surviving carrier could still impose cost off. Yorktown's ordeal became the American side of that cost. The ship's damage on June 4th reminds us that victory at Midway was not clean or weightless. It was not only a story of Japanese carriers burning under American bombs. It was also a story of an American carrier under attack, its presence at Midway made possible by emergency repair and command necessity. The same scarcity that made Yorktown invaluable also made its loss, or even its crippling, deeply consequential. For Nimitz's side, this was the paradox of Midway. The American carriers had been placed in position by intelligence, but intelligence did not shield them from return fire. Code breaking could help identify Midway as the target. It could help shape the ambush at Point Luck. It could allow scarce U.S. carrier strength to be concentrated northeast of the atoll. But once aircraft were in the air, once Japanese and American forces had found each other, the battle became a sequence of human and mechanical tests. Could a carrier launch before being found? Could aircraft locate moving ships across open ocean? Could fighter defense be in the right place? Could damaged ships stay alive long enough to matter? Yorktown had already answered one version of that question before the battle began. Damaged at Coral Sea, it had returned in time to fight at Midway. That fact made its role decisive before any bomb fell near it. Without Yorktown, the American carrier force would have been smaller. With Yorktown, Nimitz had another flight deck, another air group, another chance to find and strike the Japanese carriers. But at Midway, usefulness drew danger. Hiryu's aircraft found Yorktown and badly damaged it. The carrier's suffering became a visible sign that Japan's striking power had not vanished with the first 3 burning ships. The balance had shifted, but it had not yet settled. The Americans had wounded Nagumo's force catastrophically, yet they still had to finish the fight. Hiryu remained the problem that could not be ignored. That search now became urgent. The American commanders and airmen understood the meaning of the 4th carrier. As long as Hiryu survived, the Japanese force retained a carrier from which aircraft could strike. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had created an opening, but it had also clarified the remaining task. The 4th carrier had to be found. It had to be attacked before it could continue shaping the battle. There is a quiet cruelty in this part of Midway. The same morning that produced the famous American success also produced the blow against Yorktown. The same sequence that made Midway a turning point also revealed how narrow and costly that turn was. A few minutes over the Japanese carriers had changed the Pacific War, but those minutes did not erase the enemy's ability to answer. Hiryu's survival forced the Americans to keep fighting through uncertainty, damage, and the possibility that more attacks might come. So the battle entered its next phase, with smoke on both sides of the horizon. Behind the Japanese force, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning from the initial dive bomber strikes. Ahead of the Americans lay the hard fact of Yorktown, badly damaged by aircraft from the carrier that had escaped. The ship that had been rushed back from Coral Sea had given Nimitz a stronger hand at Midway, and now it had become the Central American victim of Hiryu's counterblow. But Hiryu's strike also revealed Hiryu's presence. The fourth carrier had shown that it was still dangerous. That made it the next and necessary target. Somewhere beyond the smoke and distance, the last surviving Japanese carrier from Nagumo's striking force still moved across the Pacific. The American task was no longer to prove that the ambush had worked. It had worked. The task now was to find the carrier that had answered and to end the threat from the final Japanese flight deck. The search for Hiryu was not a separate drama from the rest of Midway. It was the unfinished sentence left by the morning's violence. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu had already been struck in the dive bomber attacks that transformed the battle. Yorktown had already absorbed Hiryu's answer from the air. But as long as Hiryu remained afloat and able to operate aircraft, the Japanese carrier force still possessed the one thing that mattered most in the Central Pacific, a flight deck. That was the central measure of power at Midway, not the broadside of battleships over the horizon, not the weight of an invasion force still distant from the atoll, not even the number of ships moving through the operation as a whole. The decisive instrument was the aircraft carrier, because carriers could search, strike, and alter the battle before opposing surface fleets ever came within gun range. In the waters around Midway, whoever could keep flight decks operating could still reach across the sea. Hiryu had proved that point. It had escaped the first American dive bomber attack. It had remained outside the destruction that overtook the other three Japanese fleet carriers. And from that surviving deck, Japanese aircraft had found USS Yorktown and badly damaged her on June 4, 1942. Yorktown had been the carrier that should not have been there, at least not if damage from Coral Sea had kept her in repair yards. Instead, she had been rushed back into service and sent to join USS Enterprise and USS Hornet northeast of Midway. Her presence had strengthened Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's carrier force at the critical hour. Her ordeal now showed the cost of that decision. The American victory was forming, but it was not yet clean, and it was not yet complete. The sea did not give immediate certainty. Reports had to be received, sorted, believed, and acted upon. Pilots had to locate moving ships across immense distances of open water. Carriers had to launch and recover aircraft while also protecting themselves from the enemy's next attack. Even after 3 Japanese carriers were burning, the battle still depended on finding the fourth. Hiryu was found later and fatally damaged. With that strike, the carrier losses on the Japanese side became complete. The 4 named carriers at the center of Nagumo's striking force were no longer instruments of power. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Each had entered the battle as part of Japan's elite fleet carrier strength. Each had carried aircraft into the operation against Midway. Each had represented the reach of a navy that, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, was still pressing outward across the Pacific. By the end of the Midway action, all 4 were lost. The famous 4-minute frame remains powerful because it captures the shock of the initial American dive bomber attack. In those few minutes, the battle changed from a Japanese carrier operation into a Japanese carrier disaster. But the fuller story is just as important. Hiryu's survival after the first strike meant that Midway did not end all at once. The fourth carrier had time to strike back. It had time to damage Yorktown, and only after Hiryu was located and fatally hit did the carrier balance of the battle take its final form. That final form was stark. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers at Midway. The United States lost 1 aircraft carrier and 1 destroyer. Those numbers are simple, but they can mislead if spoken too quickly. They do not mean the American side passed through the battle untouched. They do not erase the losses of the torpedo squadrons, the damage to ships, or the men who did not return from the air. They do not turn Midway into a bloodless victory written only in arrows on a chart. USS Yorktown, so central to the American ambush, became the carrier the United States would lose. Yorktown's destruction unfolded in stages, and that matters. She was badly damaged by Japanese aircraft on June 4th. That damage came from Hiryu's counterattack, the last serious carrier blow delivered by Nagumo's surviving flight deck. Yorktown's struggle after the air attacks became part of the battle's lingering uncertainty. A damaged carrier was not automatically a sunk carrier. Ships could sometimes be saved. Crews could fight fire, control flooding, restore power, and try to keep a hull alive long enough to be brought home or at least kept from the enemy's final claim. But Yorktown's story did not end with the air attacks. Later, the Japanese submarine I-168 torpedoed Yorktown before she sank. The submarine attack turned a damaged carrier into a lost carrier. It also added another layer to the battle's cost. Midway is often remembered from above as a battle of scouting planes, torpedo planes, fighters, and dive bombers. But the submarine's torpedoes remind us that the Pacific War was fought through many forms of contact: radio intelligence, patrol aircraft, carrier strikes, anti-aircraft fire, damage control parties, and underwater attack. The decisive measure may have been the carrier, but the danger came from every direction. The United States also lost one destroyer. In the final accounting given by the battle's outcome, that ship stands beside Yorktown as part of the American price. The contrast remains central. 4 Japanese carriers lost against 1 American carrier, and 1 destroyer lost, but the American losses prevent the victory from becoming abstract. They keep the story human and material. Steel was torn open. Flight decks burned. Ships that had names and crews disappeared from the order of battle. Still, the strategic meaning of the carrier losses cannot be avoided. At Midway, the balance of first-line carrier strength changed. Japan did not merely lose ships, it lost 4 fleet carriers that had been central to offensive naval power. The United States lost Yorktown, a grave loss, but Enterprise and Hornet survived the battle. Nimitz's carrier force had suffered, but it had not been broken. Japan's striking force, by contrast, had lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in the same battle. That difference mattered because the Pacific was too vast for older assumptions about sea power to govern it alone. Battleships remained symbols of naval strength, and they were still powerful warships. But Midway showed, with unforgiving clarity, that the ability to project aircraft over ocean distances could decide the issue before battle lines ever closed. A carrier was not just a ship. It was a moving airfield, a search system, a strike platform, and a way to impose danger hundreds of miles away. Losing 4 of them meant losing reach. This is why the sinking of Hiryu completes more than a list. It completes the transformation of the battle. In the morning, Japan still had a carrier force capable of striking Midway and threatening the American carriers. After the first dive bomber attacks, 3 of those carriers were burning, but 1 remained. After Hiryu's counterblow, Yorktown lay badly damaged, and the outcome still carried a bitter uncertainty. After Hiryu was found and fatally damaged, the core of Nagumo's carrier striking power had been destroyed. The sea around Midway did not become quiet. The war did not end. The Japanese Navy still had ships, commanders, bases, and fighting power. The United States still faced a long Pacific War, with campaigns that would demand terrible costs. But the meaning of Midway rested on what had been removed from the board. 4 Japanese fleet carriers had entered the action. None survived it. 3 American carriers had been committed to the ambush. 1 was lost. For a war room story, this is the moment when the map changes. The lines and pins no longer represent the same balance of power they had represented only days before. The decisions made from intelligence rooms, carrier bridges, and patrol reports had converged over a remote atoll in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. The result was not a perfect victory, and it was not a painless one. It was a victory measured in carriers, in time, and in the sudden narrowing of Japan's offensive options. Yorktown's loss kept Midway from becoming a simple tale of triumph. Hiryu's destruction kept it from becoming an unfinished American success. Together, they defined the battle's final carrier accounting. Japan lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The United States lost Yorktown and 1 destroyer. And from that accounting, the larger turn of the Pacific War begins to come into view. From that accounting, the larger turn of the Pacific War begins to come into view, not as a single switch thrown in a command room, not as a war suddenly ended by one morning's violence. Midway did not make the long Pacific struggle simple. It did not erase Japan's power at sea, or the distance between American bases and the Western Pacific, or the years of fighting still ahead. But it changed the conditions under which that war would be fought. Before Midway, Japan came east with an operation designed to draw out the American carriers and destroy them near the atoll. Midway was to be bait, a forward point on the map that would help extend a defensive perimeter and force the United States into a costly response. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's larger plan moved across the Pacific with that purpose in mind. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force carried the striking power that made the operation dangerous. But by the end of the battle, the trap had closed in the opposite direction. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The United States had lost 1 aircraft carrier, USS Yorktown, and 1 destroyer. In a war where carrier aviation had become the decisive instrument of naval power, that difference mattered. Battleships still carried history, prestige, and heavy guns. But at Midway, the central measure of power was the flight deck. How many aircraft could be launched, recovered, armed, refueled, and sent back into the sky? The carriers were the moving airfields of the Pacific, and Japan's first-line carrier strength had been deeply weakened. That is why Midway is remembered as a turning point, but it has to be understood carefully. The battle did not win the Pacific War by itself. It did not mean Japan could no longer fight effectively. It did not remove the enormous difficulty of carrying an offensive across ocean distances, island by island, base by base. What it did was check Japan's eastward momentum and help shift the strategic balance away from early war Japanese expansion and toward a more defensive posture. The change was visible not just in the number of ships sunk, but in the options left afterward. A fleet that had expected to lure out and crush the American carriers had instead lost the core of the striking force that made such operations possible. The United States, though damaged and grieving, still had USS Enterprise and USS Hornet after the battle. It had also proven that intelligence, carrier aviation, and coordinated risk could blunt a larger Japanese operation before it reached its intended conclusion. That proof mattered for what came later. Midway helped create conditions for American offensives that followed, including the Guadalcanal campaign. It did not make those campaigns easy. It did not decide them in advance. But it changed the strategic weather. After Midway, the United States was no longer only trying to absorb the next blow and guess where it might land. It had shown that Japanese initiative could be disrupted, that Japanese carriers could be found, and that the Pacific map could begin to move in another direction. And still, the meaning of Midway cannot be separated from how it happened. This was not only an air battle in the open sky. It was a war room story from the beginning. In rooms where radio traffic was copied and studied, American codebreakers worked through fragments of Japanese naval communications. At Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team labored over the problem of where Japan would strike next. Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton carried that intelligence into the decision-making world of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. The Japanese designator, AF, became more than a symbol when the water shortage deception helped confirm it as Midway. A simple message about water helped turn uncertainty into a place on the map. From there, Nimitz made the decision that shaped the battle before the first bomb fell. He positioned USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown northeast of Midway in the area associated with Point Luck. That choice did not guarantee victory. It only created the possibility of one. The carriers still had to remain hidden long enough. Patrol aircraft still had to search wide ocean. Air groups still had to find moving ships. Pilots still had to fly through confusion, distance, fuel limits, and enemy fighters. The war rooms extended outward from shore into the fleet itself. They were not only basements and offices. They were plotting rooms, radio rooms, flag bridges, ready rooms, and carrier decks. On Midway, Marine defenders watched Japanese aircraft come in from the northwest. Patrol aircraft sent reports that gave shape to the enemy's approach. On the American carriers, crews launched aircraft into a morning that did not unfold cleanly. Torpedo squadrons went in at low altitude and suffered devastating losses. Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked without support. Of the 15 aircraft in that carrier-based attack, none returned, and Ensign George H. Gay was the sole surviving pilot. Those attacks did not sink the Japanese carriers, but they belonged to the chain of events that made the decisive moment possible. They drew fighters downward. They disrupted timing. They forced attention and reaction. Then, at about 10:22 to 10:26 in the morning, on June 4th, 1942, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown reached the Japanese carrier force. 4 minutes is a narrow frame for a battle that stretched across days, searches, counterattacks, damage control, submarine attack, and sinking ships. But it is not an empty phrase. In those minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit. The center of Nagumo's carrier force was devastated. Hiryu survived the first attack and struck back, badly damaging Yorktown, before being found and fatally damaged later. The battle's full cost and full result took longer to unfold. But the strategic hinge was there, in the sudden arrival of American dive bombers over Japanese flight decks. That is the contradiction at the heart of Midway, and it is why the battle still holds such force in memory. Japan came to trap the American carriers near Midway. It came with a plan built on reach, surprise, and the offensive momentum of the opening months of the Pacific War. But American intelligence had already moved the invisible pieces on the board. Nimitz did not wait blindly. The U.S. carriers were not where the Japanese plan needed them to be. They were northeast of Midway, waiting for a chance that had been created by code breaking, confirmed by deception, and carried forward by command judgment. Then came timing, then sacrifice, then carrier aviation. A remote atoll in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands became the place where those elements converged. Midway, also known in native Hawaiian contexts as Kuaihelani or Pihemanu, had seemed small against the scale of fleets and oceans. But as a forward base between Hawaii and Japan, it mattered. Its patrol aircraft, its defenders, its position, and its presence in Japanese planning made it central to a much larger contest. By the time the smoke cleared, the Pacific had not become safe. It had not become simple. But it had turned. Japan's first-line carrier strength had been weakened. Its eastward momentum had been checked. The United States had paid heavily, especially in the loss of Yorktown and the men and aircraft committed to attacks that never returned. Yet the result opened a new strategic possibility, not immediate victory, but the beginning of a shift. So the final image is not only of burning carriers. It is of separate rooms and separate decisions finally meeting over the sea. A code room reading fragments. A commander weighing risk. A patrol plane sending a report. A carrier deck launching aircraft. A torpedo squadron descending toward almost certain destruction. Dive bombers arriving in the same brief window of time over Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Hiryu answering, and then being found. Midway was a battle of minutes, but it was prepared by months of work and paid for over days of fighting. It was a victory of intelligence, timing, sacrifice, and carrier aviation. And in the Pacific War, where distance was vast and certainty was rare, those few minutes near Midway changed what both sides could believe about the war ahead.